Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we're reading the book entitled Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica Veith. This is an ebook available online for free at clashofminds.com, where you can download it and read along with us. Sonica Veith is the spouse of well-known evangelist, lecturer, university professor, and zoologist Dr. Walter Veith. And this true story is a chronicle of their life together, their ministry, their numerous trials, tribulations, and hardships, as well as their successes, victories, and triumphs. In our last reading, we covered chapter 11, entitled Vindicated. As the chapter opened, Walter returns from his European trip and opens the envelope from Sven, in which they found what seemed to them to be a huge amount of money, with instructions to buy themselves a new car. They know, with the prices of new cars in South Africa, that the money would not be enough. So they set off to visit used car dealerships to find a car to meet their needs. Not one met their needs after hours of searching. So on a whim, they decided to visit a Volkswagen dealership, only to find there were no cars available at the price they could afford, until the salesman thought he had an older model Jetta in the storage somewhere. But still the price was too high. Nonetheless, the salesman was intent on making a sale and offered them a fleet discount since Walter worked in the university. The price came to within a few cents of what they had, and they drove off, thanking God for how he had provided. Back at work, Walter's research in animal husbandry was amazingly successful, proving that Ellen White, with her third-grade education, was correct in all she taught about health. The research endeared him to his students, who started asking about his personal beliefs. Not wanting to go against the university teaching, he offered them the opportunity to meet with him after hours to get their questions answered. For many, they had never seen Christianity in the light that Walter presented it, and many were enlightened and convinced. The crowd of students at these after-hour classes grew, and with the success of their research, the wrath and jealousy of the rest of the zoology staff were incurred against him. One colleague went so far as to break into Walter's office to look at his records and brought charges against him so that he had to face a commission of inquiry without knowing what charges were brought. On the day of the inquiry, his accuser, on the way to the meeting, suddenly turned pale, fell to the floor unconscious, and was rushed to the hospital. Since the meeting couldn't be postponed or rescheduled, the commissioners brought the charges themselves, and along with Walter's testimony and that of his students, all charges were dismissed, and Walter was completely vindicated. Next, the head of the zoology department takes sick and dies, and another professor resigns due to ill health. Because of the success of his research, Walter was a favorite to assume the position, but university protocol required that the post be advertised worldwide. The options finally came down to two candidates, a Dr. Burns from London and Walter. The other candidate, ostensibly made arrangements through her South African domiciled mother to see the facilities and meet with Walter. Walter never received any such arrangement, and the lady withdrew from the post, claiming that she had never been treated so rudely, for when she arrived to meet Walter, he wasn't there. Despite Walter's protests, the selection committee accused him of trying to get rid of her in order to secure the position for himself. Then, suddenly, one of the selection members recalled that he had received a phone call making an appointment with him for a certain date and time. When the date and time came and nobody showed up, he dismissed it. It turned out that when the mother had called the reception at the university and asked for Dr. Veith, she was transferred to Dr. White's in botany. Again, Walter's name was fully cleared, and again he was vindicated and granted the position of head of the zoology department. Then came the riots. Political agitators combined with some students to protest certain university issues, but many students did not go along and continued with their classes. However, the demonstrators, led by non-student agitators, stormed the university, destroying classrooms, property, and beating up students who did not join the protesters by crushing the kneecaps of the male students and dragging the females by their hair outside and beating them up. When the rioters arrived at the hall where Walter was lecturing, he told the terrified students to lock the door, and he would face the rioters. Standing in front of the locked doors, he tried to reason with the crowd, but they ignored him and tried to force the doors open with the weight of the crowd pressing Walter to the door. He felt his ribs crack under the pressure as they tried 7 times to break down the doors and finally left without success. Walter did not realize that the press was also there, and the next day, his picture was in the newspapers as the professor who stood up to the rioters. The following day, when the university senate met to discuss the matter, the rioters once again stormed the hall where they were beating against the huge glass wall that separated them. The great glass wall shattered under the relentless pressure, removing the wall of separation between the rioters and the Senate. Again, Walter inserted himself before the crowd, trying to reason with them, and the Senate members hurriedly departed through a back door to safety. When the crowd recognized that the Senate members had run, they hurriedly raced to the back of the building to try and catch them, leaving Walter alone and safe. But the Senate members had enough time to reach safety, and again, Walter had been protected by God, and he thanked him for saving his life. Despite all this, jealousy and hate for Walter continued to grow in his department, and yet another colleague brought charges against him and one of his postgraduate students who had now turned out to be his colleague. Again it came to a committee hearing. But as the charges were read and explained, they were found to be fabricated and spurious. And once again, Walter was vindicated, and the accuser became the accused. Much like Satan, the accuser of the brethren, will be, at the end, in the judgment, become the accused and suffer the punishment that God has reserved for those who have left their first estate. Dear listeners, please remember that you can download this book for free at clashofminds.com and read along with us as we pick up the story today in chapter 12, entitled, Let No One Deceive You. Luke 21, verse 8. And he said, Take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. There was a faint knock at the back door, and a young man stepped into the kitchen. He startled me, and I just barely recognized him as one of the young people who had been attending Walter's evangelistic meetings in the town hall in Somerset West the past few weeks. He greeted me friendly and proceeded to hop onto the kitchen counter and started chatting as if he had known us for years. I thought his behavior rather strange and presumptuous, but even though I felt somewhat uncomfortable, I remember what Paul had said in Hebrews 13 and verse 2. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. I offered him something to eat and drink, and he stayed till evening when the rest of the family arrived home. Clive told us that he was a recently baptized Adventist who had come out of one of the Pentecostal churches, and that he was studying theology and lived in the dormitory at the Adventist college. We chatted till the children went to bed, and when Walter excused himself to do some computer work, I was left with the embarrassing task of coaxing Clive to leave. I offered to drive him back to the college, since it was quite a distance to walk, and he accepted gladly. On the way, Clive was suddenly very quiet. I glanced at him, but he kept staring in front of him. Are you okay? Are you tired? I asked. He didn't answer at first, but after a strained silence, he said, I want to tell you something, but I'm scared you will reject me. You can tell me. I won't reject you, I said carefully. Everyone always rejected me. My mother and father died in a motorbike accident when I was very small, and my brothers and I were placed in a foster home. But after a short while, they didn't want me there any longer, and I was passed on from one foster family to the next. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of my epileptic fits. I've bashed my face and broken my front teeth so many times during some fits. Here at the college, I have no one to take care of me. Only the headmaster, Mr. Cummins, has been very kind to me and often pops in to see how I'm doing. Sometimes I wake up in the bathroom 2 days after having a fit, and no one took notice. That's terrible. How can people be so heartless? I said indignantly as my motherly instincts took over. He just sat quietly as we drove along. When I stopped in front of his dormitory, he took my hand and squeezed it. I hope you won't reject me, but I know you won't because you're such a caring person. He then thanked me warmly and waved as he disappeared into the building. On my way home, I was struggling to understand what had just happened. On the one hand, I had an awkward, uneasy feeling at the pit of my stomach. But on the other hand, I had compassion on the lonely soul who had no one to take care of him. I wondered if God wanted to use me to help him. After all, he did seem to trust and appreciate me, and I couldn't disappoint him now. I resolved to try and help him find a home where he would be safe and be nourished spiritually, physically, and emotionally. Isn't this what Jesus would want us to do? The following Sabbath, Clive came to us for lunch after church, and our friend Jane was there too. Clive was talking to our children and some of the other younger people when Jane remarked, "What a nice young man he seems to be, so polite and spiritual, always quoting scripture and reading his Bible." After I told her a little about his background, I asked if she needed a boarder to help supplement her income. When she became an Adventist, her relationship with her husband deteriorated, and soon thereafter he divorced her and left. She only had a small income from a part-time job and occasionally took students in to help her and her 2 boys get by. She needed the money and also thought he would benefit by her feeding his brain with healthy home-cooked food, and said she would think about it. The next day, she phoned and agreed to take him in. Because we were still burdened by the heavy yoke of debt from the farm, we decided to sell our little railway house, buy a plot, and build a house. We would get a team to build the brick walls, fit the windows, and put up the roof. But all the painting, tiling, and dry walls we would do ourselves. Walter worked at the university during weekdays, and at nights and weekends he would work on the house. I did the painting and the tiling of the floors and bathrooms. It took us 3 years to finish the house, and for many months our children used boxes to build their own bedroom walls on the top floor until Walter was able to erect the dry walls. During this time, Walter was expanding his lecture series, and he had just started scratching the surface of Freemasonry and its connection with the occult, the Protestant churches, and the papacy, when there was a knock on our front door at midnight. In a daze, Walter stumbled to the door, wondering who on earth was up at this hour. He opened the door and saw a man standing in the shadows of the porch with a very large book in his hands. "Dr. Veith, you don't know me. I work at the paint shop in town. You might have seen me there. I'm sorry to bother you, but I have some important information for you." What can be so important to warrant a visit at midnight? Walter invited him in, but he refused. "I'm going to give you till 4 o'clock in the morning to look at this book, and then I will fetch it again. I'm a member of the Freemason Lodge here, and if they find out that I have given you this information, I'll be in big trouble." Apprehensively, Walter took the book and thanked the man, who disappeared quickly up the street. 4 hours to study such a thick book? By now, I was anxious to know what had happened, and I joined him in his study as he paged through the book filled with pictures and drawings. There displayed for only the initiated were all the secret hand signals, the signs and symbols, the layout of the lodges, the names of the Grand Masters and well-known officials and politicians, the regalia that they wear, and most intriguingly, the secret history and the connections that Masonry has with all walks of life. "Wow, this is amazing information," Walter said as he grabbed his camera and proceeded to take photographs of every interesting page. I returned to bed, but he kept working until he heard the faint knock on the door again. The man retrieved his valuable possession and left in a hurry without a word. Now, Walter had a whole arsenal of ammunition to prove that secret societies are a breeding place for deception and all kinds of iniquities, and that they have infiltrated governments and rulers, as well as Christianity and other religions, under the garb of commendable humanitarian deeds. And behind it all sits the Antichrist, dancing to the tune of Lucifer, the arch-enemy of God. The Lord hates all deception, secrecy, and guile. This is Satan's work. The work of God is open and frank. Testimonies to Ministers, page 274, paragraph 1. It was not safe for you to have any part with this secret order. Those who stand under the blood-stained banner of Prince Emmanuel cannot be united with the Freemasons or any secret organization. The seal of the living God will not be placed upon anyone who maintains such a connection after the light of truth has shone upon his pathway. Christ is not divided, and Christians cannot serve God and Mammon. Letter 21, 1893. Also, Evangelism, page 622, and paragraph 1. A few weeks later, we heard the shocking news that the employee at the paint shop was arrested and sent to prison. No one knows why, and we never saw him again. We were devastated, and for the first time, we realized the seriousness of the matter. Satan does not appreciate being exposed, and he will do his utmost to destroy those who do it. In our walk with God from this time on, we were in a full-on battle against the host of evil. The more the devil was being exposed through Walter's lectures, the greater was his ire towards him and our family. If it were not for the continuous protection of our God, we would not have survived. The great deceiver fears that we shall become acquainted with his devices. It is because Satan can readily control the minds of those who are unconscious of his influence that the Word of God unveils before us his secret forces, thus placing us on guard. From Here to Forever, page 318, paragraph 3. Walter still traveled to Germany and Canada during his university vacations, and then I was left with dealing with all the crises at the school and at home. One cold winter's morning, I herded the children down to the basement where our car was in the garage, and to my dismay, the whole basement was 6 inches underwater. Since the children had to get to school, I had no time to deal with it. But when I returned, I discovered that the water was warm. "Oh no, it's the geyser," I mumbled to myself. Walter had been away for a couple of weeks, so I was on my own again. I managed to find a plumber who arrived soon afterwards, and as he searched for the leak at the geyser, he stopped, took off his well-used cap, and scratched his head pensively. "That's strange. There's no leak on the geyser. There must be a burst pipe somewhere." He started searching through the floating objects and stumbled upon the source from where the hot water was bubbling out into the basement. After he had drained out the water from the garage, he looked closely at the copper pipe. There were puncture holes in the pipe, and just a few feet away lay a dead mole. "I've never seen anything like this," the plumber mused. It seems a mole had burrowed through the concrete floor and then chewed his way through the copper pipe. The boiling hot water must have killed him when it came spurting out. But how in the world could a mole chew through a concrete floor and then through a copper pipe? But I knew how. A little while later, still struggling to make ends meet, I decided to take up the challenge to work for an Adventist man who was notorious for his verbal abuse of his workers as well as his poor wife. No one was willing to work for him, but we desperately needed the money. And even though his wife warned me not to accept the job, I was determined. I worked the long hours and endured the scolding and shouting. But often, it became too much for me, and I would take my lunch hour, rush home to have a good cry, eat a cookie or two, and then return to the detention barracks. On one such an occasion, as I got to our house, I saw water pouring out from under the front door. My heart sank, and as I opened the door, I noticed water seeping through the floorboards of the top story. Our lounge furniture and the whole kitchen were underwater. I rushed to the top story and stood in dismay as I watched water squirting from the bathroom wall. A pipe had burst in the wall. The plumber just shook his head as he once again came to my rescue. "Having some bad luck lately, eh?" I wanted to say to him, "There is no such thing as good or bad luck," but I thought he wouldn't understand, so I just nodded. I knew that Satan was angry with the work which Walter was doing more than 16,000 kilometers away, but I was determined not to despair or fret. That night, I prayed with the children and thanked Jesus that he was still watching over us even though things go wrong. We still had dry beds to sleep in and food on our table, which is much more than many people had in their tin shacks amidst the bitter cold of Cape Town. One Sunday morning, a brother in the church who was a builder came to build us a low retaining wall in order to prevent rainwater from our driveway running down into our neighbor's property. He was working alone, whistling softly to himself, when there was a loud knock on our front door. I was surprised when I saw two police officers standing outside, dressed in full police attire, complete with revolvers and batons in their holsters. "We received a complaint from your neighbors that you are working on Sunday," one of them tried to explain. "Excuse me?" I asked in unbelief. "Well," the other officer said as he shifted uncomfortably from one leg to the other, "I don't see you disturbing the peace, but we will have to lodge the complaint with the magistrate, and we will advise you when you have to appear in court. Just thought we'd let you know. Good day." I was devastated. Accused of working on Sunday? And we were not disturbing anyone. In fact, we were building the wall to benefit those very neighbors who had lodged the case against us. For the first time, fear gripped my heart. I was alone with my 3 children. How was I going to deal with this crisis on my own? I slept very little that week and prayed that God would give me the strength to handle the situation. A few days later, the same officers returned. I expected a summons, but they said that the magistrate threw out the case. He threw out the case? Why? I asked. The strange thing is, the complaint was not actually that you were working on the Sunday, because there is no active law in the country that you may not work on Sundays. The complaint was that you do not work on Saturdays. Your neighbors want the court to somehow intervene and force you to work on Saturdays, which of course is ridiculous, and the very reason the magistrate threw out the case. With that brief explanation, the officers greeted me politely and drove off, while our other neighbors peeped inquisitively through their curtains. Puzzled, but relieved, I shut the door to the staring eyes across the street and thanked God for solving another of my many problems. In the meantime, Walter was having a blessed yet exhausting trip in Canada. The ministry that invited him to speak in Vancouver had rented a hall, which strangely enough seated 1,260 persons. Every night, the hall was filled up with visitors and church members, except for one seat that was always open right in front, just a few meters from where Walter was standing at the podium. A few minutes into the lecture, the side door would open and a Down syndrome boy would walk in, unattended by any parent or guardian. The young lad would make his way straight to the only unoccupied seat, almost as if he knew the seat was reserved for him. And there he would sit, singing softly to himself until the end of the lecture. Then he would disappear into the crowd. This ritual would repeat itself night after night. One night, however, towards the end of the lecture series, some of the people in the audience came to the front after the lecture, crowded around Walter, and aggressively argued with him about the Bible and the identification of the Antichrist. Then Walter noticed the Downs boy get up from his seat, walk toward the stage, and elbow his way through the crowd until he was standing right in front of him. He looked up into Walter's face, the tip of his tongue hanging from the side of his mouth, and then put his arms around Walter's waist while resting his head on his chest, all the while singing softly to himself. The shouting and arguing suddenly quieted down. The aggressors looked at the scene of the boy clinging to the speaker and then turned around and walked away. Walter was grateful that he had a few moments of peace and failed to notice as the boy disappeared amongst the people in the foyer. During the next few lectures, Walter anxiously anticipated the quiet entry of his little supporter into the hall. He was relieved that his seat was vacant every night, and at the end of the lecture, he again made his way through the crowd to wrap his arms around the speaker. One by one, the accusers had no more words to say and left. When Walter asked the organizers if they knew who the parents or guardians of the boy were and where he came from, no one had any idea. The lectures in that large hall ended, but the meetings were to continue in the Adventist church. Walter was sure that he would lose his Downs friend, who would have to travel many kilometers to the church on the other side of the city. A little sad, he continued his presentations in the church, certain that he would never see the boy again. However, just as he started his last lecture, his eye caught a familiar figure walking down the aisle, and to his surprise, his stubby little friend walked straight to the seat in front of the pulpit. How on earth? How was this possible? Walter thought as he watched the boy settle down, singing softly to himself. No parents? No friends? How did he get there? After the lecture, all the people went to the foyer for drinks, and Walter stayed alone on the stage packing up his slides. Suddenly, the boy walked onto the stage and again put his arms around him with his head on his shoulder. Walter looked down into the face of the boy, took him gently by the shoulders and said, "Now tell me the truth. Who are you? Are you an angel?" The boy suddenly stood up straight, turned his eyes upward, lifted his arm up, and pointed to heaven. Then, without saying a word, he turned and went down the steps and disappeared into the crowd. That was the last anyone had seen or heard of him. Walter was encouraged and uplifted by this token from God. And even though he thought he was fighting the battle alone, God was always there. He never forgot his Downs angel and often thinks of those sweet moments. He was also especially blessed by the acceptance of the message by many of the people who attended the meetings. The Lord had broken through the secularism and atheism of a nation who thought they had everything and yet were poor. The messages spread through Canada as well as the US, and many seeds were sown for Christ. Unfortunately, the 3 disciples who were on the Mount of Transfiguration with their beloved Jesus had to come back down into the valley where the demon-possessed child was waiting for them. After the Lord has bestowed on us the richest blessings, does not some sore trial come to us to darken our souls and cause us to doubt God's goodness? Let us, at such times, remember that Christ was tempted in all points like we are tempted, and that in his strength we can overcome. Let us, by prayer and fasting, draw near to God. Manuscript Releases number 21, page 11, paragraph 1. Back at home, I was facing increasing challenges which drained my physical and spiritual energy and often discouraged me. At first, I did not realize that the devil was working to destroy our family. I was just trying to survive with all the work of housekeeping, keeping a job under difficult circumstances, and trying to help our children with their challenges at school. They had entered the dreaded teenage stage without their father being there physically most of the time, and I naively thought that their attending the Adventist school would protect and guide them. Sure, they were guided, but unfortunately, right into the hands of rebellious and unconverted peers and teachers. They were mocked for everything we as their parents taught them and stood for, and were slowly influenced into thinking that we were fanatical. Adventists invited them to have a brawl or a barbecue where they grilled meat and told them that it was not necessary for them to be so narrow-minded. After all, they reasoned, Jesus wants us to be happy. He came to give us life more abundantly. Besides our stand on the health message, the church was increasingly criticizing the work that Walter was doing. We were not prepared for what lay ahead of us. For us, this was the beginning of a very long controversy, a battle that started in heaven and will only end when our God Himself will put an end to it. We were rudely awakened from our initial perception that all is safe and sound in the church. Even more astounding to us was the discovery that a large majority of those who had been longer in the church than us, born and bred Adventists, had not the slightest idea what they believe, and even less as to why they believe it. The age-old battle was raging even more fiercely inside our beloved church than outside in the world from which we had come. The pearl of great price and His truth, for which we had sacrificed everything, family, friends, money, and lands, was being thrown before the swine. We have more to fear from within than from without. The hindrances to strength and success are far greater from the church itself than from the world. How often have the professed advocates of the truth proved the greatest obstacle to its advancement? Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 122. Also found in Last Day Events, page 156, paragraph 2. You should preach more about the love of Christ, not all this fear-mongering, someone in the church once said to Walter after one of his lectures. Fear-mongering? It is love for Christ in the people that makes me want to warn them of what is coming. Haven't you read the great controversy? Am I preaching anything other than what is in the Bible in the spirit of prophecy? Walter answered. No, but you're scaring people away with your constant harping on the three angels' message and the papacy, the man said in an irritated tone. If you think the three angels' messages are not a revelation of God's love and care for humanity, then you shouldn't call yourself an Adventist, Walter said indignantly as he walked away. As he was grumbling to himself, he became more determined to present to the people more information on how cunningly Satan and his agents on earth have infiltrated governments and churches, families, schools, and all walks of society. The Bible clearly warns of the despicable and mysterious works of Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, and the Antichrist who persecuted God's people through the ages. How fitting that Babylon means confusion, since one of the last things Jesus warned his disciples about was to take heed that you be not deceived. When Walter returned home, the onslaught on us became even more relentless. Not satisfied with their failed attempt to get us into trouble, our neighbors once again launched an attack. One night, as we were trying to relax before bedtime, there was a frantic knock on our door. When Walter opened the door, our neighbor burst into our house shouting, "What did you do with our cat?" "Your cat? What do you mean?" "Yes, My wife's cat. You sacrificed him. If he's dead, just tell me where you buried him." Walter and I looked at each other in disbelief. I started saying that we haven't seen his cat, but he just kept on repeating that we sacrificed his cat and that he wants to know where the body is and that his wife had a nervous breakdown because of us and had to go to her mother. When his tirade was over, he stormed out the door back to his house and slammed his front door so loudly that the sound echoed like a voodoo drum through the valley. "Oh, please, not again," we sighed. We were so tired of defending ourselves against the world and the church that we almost despaired. We called the children and prayed that God would help the neighbors to find their cat. And then we went to bed with heavy hearts. A few days later, our youngest son noticed a cat crawling into a water drain. "It sure looks like the neighbor's cat," he said excitedly. The municipality had been working on our road, and the frightened cat must have crawled into the pipe for safety. I went down to the drain with some food and tried to coax the jittery animal out of the drain. He must have been very hungry, because like a flash, he dashed toward the food. But I was waiting for him. I scooped him up, held him close to me, and ran back to our house, where we kept him in a room and gave him food and water. I was torn apart by the petrified animal. Blood was dripping everywhere, but I sighed a sigh of relief. It was worth it. Now we could prove to our neighbor that we did not sacrifice his cat. Walter went down to the neighbor's house and posted a notice on his door which said, "We have found your cat in the storm drain. He's safe and sound with us. Please come and collect him when you get back from work." That evening, the knock on the door was even louder, and the man was even more irate. "Oh, so you think you're clever, but I'm not stupid. You've been hiding our cat in your house all this time to sacrifice him. And now you pretend that you found him in the storm drain. I'm not that stupid. You haven't heard the end of this," he shouted as he grabbed the cat from my arms and stormed back to his house, slamming his door twice as hard as before. We all just looked at one another, our children baffled at the rudeness of the man. We were trying to help, and then he treats us this way? Uncle Frenchie's words once again rang in our ears. Every good deed will be punished. And that is very true, but it was a hard lesson for all of us to learn. We had done no harm to our neighbors, but they were annoyed by our going to church on Saturdays and not Sundays, and presumably, because they regarded us as a weird sect, they assumed that we sacrificed animals. They didn't even know why they hated us so much. They were unaware that Satan was bent on making our lives as hard as possible by using them as agents to sap our strength and tempt us to doubt God and lose our faith. But something worse was yet to come. While Walter was exposing deceptions to the world, we were unaware that deception was breeding right under our noses. We had started Bible studies for the youth in our home on Friday nights, and our children had invited their friends as well. Not all were Adventists, and there were many who were very skeptical at first. Some of them who were attending the Adventist school were, unbeknownst to us, drug dealers. But after they discovered the truth, they gave up their life of sin and rebellion and decided to study theology. Today, they are pastors in the Adventist church. Some seeds, however, fell on stony ground. They sprung up eagerly, but soon it was evident that they were not rooted in Christ. Among those who visited us regularly was Clive, the young theology student who had epilepsy. He had meals with us, went on trips with us, and even slept over on weekends. He had become part of the family, although his intensity became too much for us at times. We noticed that a strange spirit developed in our family, and often, when we would withdraw from him, he would have an epileptic fit. It was very disturbing to watch, and for days afterward, he would stay with us and sleep over until he recovered. On one occasion, Walter and I planned to go out alone with friends, and since I was a little late, our friends were waiting downstairs for me. Clive was also waiting in the lounge with the rest, apparently reading his Bible as usual. But, as witnessed by our friends, as I came down the stairs, he started behaving strangely, pacing up and down. The moment, however, when I came within sight, he fell down on the floor and started tossing violently from side to side. It was a full-blown epileptic fit. During this time, his blue eyes would turn dark and his features became changed. We managed to get him to a bed, but our night out was ruined. We felt exceedingly uncomfortable as it dawned upon us that Clive was even able to bring an epileptic fit upon himself in order to manipulate a situation. Soon, Walter and I started arguing about everything, especially about how to deal with him. Walter wanted to tell him to leave, but I was convinced that God wanted us to help him. After all, didn't Jesus heal the sick and never turned anyone away? One late night, there was a knock at the door. It was dark and cloudy, and outside in the cold stood a young girl, perhaps in her 20s. "Hello? Can I help you?" asked Walter. "Hello, I'm Elsa. I attended one of your Bible studies with the youth. I don't really know why I'm here, but God told me that you have something to tell me about the Bible." "That's interesting," Walter said. "Come inside." We walked toward the lounge to find out more about this girl. She told us that she was an asthma sufferer and lived with her mother and uncle, but that she was being abused by her uncle. "Please, can you help me?" she pleaded helplessly. Walter started to tell her about the origin of sin and why there is so much misery on this planet. He got up to fetch her a Bible so that she could follow when he quoted the texts. But the moment she had the Bible in her hands, she started getting an asthma attack. We then stopped the study and waited for her to catch her breath. 3 times, Walter tried to open the scriptures to her, but each time she had an asthma attack. We gave up trying to do the Bible study, and since it was very late and she was afraid to go back home, I made her a bed on the lounge floor. Now we found ourselves in a situation that had opened the door to even more stress on our family. And for the next few weeks, we not only had the problem of dealing with Clive and his epilepsy, but also with Elsa and her asthma. And to crown it all, we were constantly arguing with each other. They had virtually taken over our home, and we were exhausted and at our wits' end. I was aware of their emotional manipulation, but at that point, we never realized we were dealing with demonic presences in our home. It became apparent that Clive was simultaneously misusing the kindness of other families and young ladies at the college, worming himself into their lives and destroying relationships, all under the garb of love for the truth and piety. His presence had wreaked havoc in our home, and I decided it was time to confront him. One day, he came to visit me while I was alone at home, which he usually did when he wanted me to make him something to eat. But instead, I told him that I wanted to talk to him. I sat him down and told him calmly that what he was doing was not right, and that he should stop manipulating people and destroying relationships. The courage to be so bold could only have been from God, since I never confronted anyone like that before. I had hardly finished the sentence when he jumped up, rushed to the bathroom, and splashed his face with cold water. His mouth had gone white, and his eyes had turned dark. Oh no, I thought, he's going to have another fit. But instead, he came and stood in front of me and pointed a shaking finger straight at me. His boyish face seemed to change into stone, and through his teeth, he hissed at me, "You are from the devil." With that, he turned around and stormed out to his car, and with tires screeching and engine roaring, he disappeared around the corner. In silence, I stood staring through the window, shocked at what had just happened. I fell on my knees and asked God to help me. Even though I knew now that Satan had taken full control of him, I still struggled to let go. I prayed that if God wanted us to continue working with Clive, then he must let him make contact with us again before 1 week was over. If not, then I will have accepted that God himself would take care of the situation, and it would no longer be our cross to carry. It was Friday, late afternoon, when I got up from my knees and continued preparing for the Sabbath. During the following week, we heard nothing from Clive. But then, on the Friday evening just after Sabbath had started, we received a phone call from a theology student who knew us and Clive very well. "I'm so sorry to have to bring you this terrible news, but Clive drowned in the ocean this afternoon." There was silence on our side as we tried to come to grips with it. "Drowned? You mean he's dead?" I gasped. "Yes," the student replied. "I'll be bringing his body to the college where he will be buried." Fear and guilt gripped my heart as I sank down onto the floor. What have I done? I should never have confronted him, I whispered. Walter sat down beside me. "It's not your fault," he said. "God took care of the problem himself. You had asked God for a sign, and now he has given you the answer. He knew we were not able to deal with it any longer. We have been carrying this burden for almost 7 years now. Satan deceived us. He tried to destroy our family and our work for God by sending that man to us. And now God himself intervened. Trust God. He knows what we can endure. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. We had just learned a valuable but painful lesson, and I pleaded with God to give me more discernment and to protect us from being deceived again. I thought of Eve, who was confident that she had it all under control, while being completely unaware that she was speaking to the devil and being deceived by his hypnotic spell. How terrible she must have felt when too late she realized what had happened and that the sanctity of her peaceful home, Eden, had been violated. It was not long after Clive's death that Elsa also suddenly disappeared off the scene, and we never heard of her again. It felt like a huge weight had been lifted from our shoulders, and peace, once again, returned to our home. The end of chapter 12 of Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica Veith.